it is strange what is happening. It is very strange. People in the Trump administration, Donald Trump included, have talked about fighting like hell against the left. And they talk about fighting left-wing terrorism and left-wing extremism. And you should take terrorists away from society. Terrorists should not be in society. Left-wing terrorists, right-wing terrorists as well should not be in society. But they're singling out left-wingers. They're singling out left-wing extremists and other people who may not be extremist. And they're saying, well, we have to fix America. And the one in the Trump administration who has really made the most extreme rhetoric is probably Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller is this Zionist, hardcore pro-Israel guy who also will reference a racist organization like American Renaissance. And he has been really the most extreme in his expression. Recently, he stated that the Democrat Party is basically a terrorist organization. And when you say things like that, you've automatically left the realm of just referring to left-wing extremists. Now you're talking about the Democrat Party, and you're referring to it as a terrorist organization. That's very dangerous ground, because that would imply that anyone who is a member of the Democrat Party is a member of a terrorist organization. And that leaves the door open for state persecution against people simply for the membership, simply for their political affiliation, or simply for what party they are members of. And that is a very, very dangerous precedent. And remember, this is coming from people who want to deport people for criticizing Israel. What makes us think they're just going to stop at immigrants? What makes us think they're just going to stop at people who have temporary residence here, or people who are living here legally but are not citizens? What makes us think they're going to stop at just non-citizens? What makes us think that they're not going to one day pursue citizens for criticizing Israel? That's the problem. And so this is what I fear. I fear that this rhetoric is going to escalate to the point where they're going to be going after people who are not terrorists. They're going to be going after people for simply criticizing Israel, or simply criticizing the United States, simply criticizing American foreign policy, expressing speech that is deemed as unpatriotic, expressing speech that is deemed as anti-American. That's the fear that I have. Now, Charlie Kirk was murdered. What happened to him was a crime. And people who praise murder should not be tolerated. In my opinion, should not be tolerated. And that goes for any sort of murder, regardless of the political affiliation of the perpetrator. If it's right-wing murder, if it's a right-wing terrorist committing murder, such as the case of Anders Breivik, such as the case of the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, such as the case of the El Paso Walmart massacre that took place in 2019, in which an American neo-Nazi targeted Mexicans because he wanted to murder Mexicans. And no one in the right wing talked about that as enthusiastically as they are talking about what recently took place. It doesn't really matter. Murder is murder and should not be praised. The problem is the selective outrage. Should we be outraged about Charlie Kirk's murder? Yes, absolutely. People who praise the murder of Charlie Kirk should not really be tolerated, because those people will go on to various social media accounts. They'll say, yeah, what happened was great. And that is incitement. And inciting violence should never be tolerated, regardless of the political affiliation of the inciter. Doesn't matter if it's a left-winger inciting violence or a right-winger inciting violence. But we have had a decent share of right-wing violence in the Western world. And I never saw the right wing or the conservatives talking about how we should suppress the speech of those who are praising right-wing violence. I never heard that. Why the selective outrage? Why the silence on right-wing violence, but the fixation on left-wing violence? Because it's not about stopping violence. It's not about preventing violence. It's about control. It's about changing the country. It's about orchestrating an absolute transformation of the United States. It's about making America right-wing. That's what this is. They want to reorganize society. They want to re-engineer society to be nationalistic and ultra-patriotic and also militaristic, because this is to the benefit of the military-industrial complex. So they're taking a tragedy, which is the murder of Charlie Kirk, and they're using it for a political agenda, which is what governments tend to do when something like this takes place. It goes back to the Machiavellian strategy of using any sort of catastrophe or tragedy or disaster to one's own advantage. It goes back to the Gladio operation, which was conducted by the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies back in the Cold War, wherein they actually conducted terrorist attacks in Europe, such as the Bologna massacre in Italy or the Brabant killings in Belgium, to then get people to become angry at the left. This was the entire purpose of the Gladio operation. It was to provoke anger against the left. This was a part of the Cold War. This was a part of the Cold War strategy of getting people to be angry at the left, to in turn get angry against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was the mecca of socialist. It was the mecca of disseminating socialist/Marxist propaganda. If you look at, for example, what's it called? Justice theology. What's it called? Basically, Marxist theology mixing Catholicism with Marxism, which was very popular in Latin America. A lot of that was being pushed by the Soviets. So the United States wanted to do a counter-Marxist operation. So what did they do? They started doing terrorist attacks in various parts of Europe. The biggest one being the Bologna massacre, in which they put a bomb in a plaza in the city of Bologna and slaughtered, a couple dozen people or so. And they did this to get people to become angry, to think that it was the leftists who did it. This was the whole purpose of Gladio. Operation Northwood had the same purpose, although Operation Northwood was never carried out because John F. Kennedy refused to co-sign it. So, he ended up getting murdered. But Operation Northwood, and I talked about this last week, but I'll bring it up again. Operation Northwood would have conducted terrorist attacks in the United States. The whole point was to do terrorist attacks in the United States, murder Americans, and then blame those murderers on the Cuban government. This was the whole purpose of Operation Northwood. So these types of false flag attacks, or what they call strategy of tension, this whole strategy of tension, literally creating tension in society, is done through terrorists. It's done through terrorism. It's done through murder. And when you have a terrorist attack that takes place, governments tend to use those attacks for their own advantage, to advance some sort of a policy. Imagine if it was the case that a right-wing terrorist sniped Bill Maher, or sniped Jimmy Kimmel, or sniped some liberal Democrat personality, whoever he may be. And we have a president who's a Democrat, right? Just imagine this hypothetical situation. And then the Democrat president says, well, we have to really take down right-wing terrorism. Don't sit there and pretend that you wouldn't be alarmed by such language. You would be. 100%. You would be alarmed by such language. Look, they're using this violence to try to persecute Christians and conservatives. You would be doing that. When the Christchurch massacre happened in New Zealand, the government said, well, we really have to crack down on guns. And the conservatives, both in America and in other parts of the world, were saying, look, the Western, these liberals, they want to use this massacre as a way to take away our guns. So the conservatives want to talk about empathy. Of course, we have to have empathy. Of course, we shouldn't be praising violence at all. But let's not sit here and pretend like conservatives wouldn't be outraged if it was the other way around. If it was a conservative or a right-wing terrorist murdering a liberal and then a Democrat president coming out saying we have to crack down on right-wing hate speech. We would be losing our minds. We would be seething right now. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about empathy, all right? We wouldn't be sitting here saying, yeah, let's clap our hands and end right-wing terrorism. I mean, I want to end right-wing terrorism, but I know most Republicans wouldn't be sitting there saying, well, yeah, we got to crack down on right-wing terrorism. They wouldn't. Let's be real here. So stop the double standards. We have to have a single standard of morality. Murder is murder. And the murder of Charlie Kirk is murder. Should not be praised, should not be encouraged. And the leftists who sit there and clap their hands to it and say, this is great, they should face consequences. Absolutely. They should not be tolerated because you don't want those people in your society. They're only going to make it worse. But let's be real here. When the Christchurch massacre happened, there were conservatives, right-wingers, who were making excuses for that. There was a Nazi in New Zealand, Christchurch, New Zealand. He went into a mosque and he mowed people down and he got it all on film. He friggin' live streamed the whole damn thing. Live streamed it. You can watch it. I don't recommend that you watch it. It's very horrifying. But he live streamed the whole thing and you see him gunning down people as if they're just targets. Like he's doing target he's gunning down these people like he's playing a video game. That's how I would describe it. And he's laughing and it's just horrific. Really horrific. And I remember Milo Yiannopoulos saying, well, this is the result of mass migration. He's a product of the mass migration policy. This is what happens when you push people. Making excuses for mass murder. That's what Milo Yiannopoulos was doing. And I didn't hear any one of these sycophants on the right saying, Milo, shut the F up. Really. I didn't hear any of them saying that. And I can guarantee you, if we had a Democrat in office in America at that time saying, hey, we got to crack down on right-wing terrorism, all the right-wingers of America would be losing their shit. So let's take a step back and let's analyze what the hell the right-wingers are actually trying to do. We can mourn Charlie Kirk's murder. We can be very sad about it, absolutely. We can grieve it, absolutely. And we should condemn it, absolutely. But let's take a step back and remember the Machiavellian behavior that is rampant in politics. Let's be real here. There was a guy who was murdered when Donald Trump's ear got nicked by the bullet. Donald Trump's ear got nicked, and somebody in the crowd was murdered. Remember that? Well, what happened the next day? Donald Trump was playing golf. Somebody was murdered at his rally. One of his diehard loyal fans. Imagine. Diehard loyal fan gets murdered at your rally. He took the time to come to your rally to listen to you, and he gets murdered listening to you. And you're golfing the next day. Charlie Kirk gets murdered. The next day, Donald Trump is at Yankee Stadium, waving his hands around. So let's not sit here and act like, well, the president's, he's really concerned, let's take a step back and understand the Machiavellianism that's occurring behind the curtains here. Like seriously. And the conservatives, of all people, should understand this, because every time we've had a mass shooting in this country, what do conservatives always bring up? I don't hear conservatives mourning the death of children getting shot at schools. We had the, what was it called? The massacre here in Texas a couple of years ago. What was it called? I can't remember. It was a Uvalde. We had the Uvalde, Texas massacre. In Texas. Bunch of kids got murdered. Horrific, right? Horrific! Imagine kids getting murdered in a school. In a freaking school. Parents go drop their kids off. And that's the same day the kids are murdered. Horrific! Horrific! In America, not Gaza. Not Ukraine. In America, Texas. Massacre is happening. And what were conservatives talking about? They're going to take away our guns. Oh, they're going to take away our guns. They're going to take away our guns. I didn't hear any of them freaking grieving. So don't give me this bullshit, really. Like, oh, we got to, the president is really concerned. He was in Yankee Stadium the next day. Somebody was murdered at one of his rallies. He was playing golf the next day. That's not all. Like, let's not really let's try not to immerse ourselves in the, I don't know what to call it, quagmire of propaganda. I don't know, propaganda war. I don't know what you would call it. But we had a massacre in 2019 in Walmart, not in Gaza, not in some other country, not in a war zone, in America, in Texas, El Paso, Walmart massacre, 2019. 23 people were murdered. 23 people were murdered as they were shopping. They went to the store to go get some food, just regular people. And almost all the victims were Hispanic because the guy who shot them all was a Nazi who hated Mexicans. I didn't hear a conservative saying, fuck, man, I am so mad right now. I was upset. I remember listening to the news on the radio when it happened. And I heard on the radio there was a massacre. People were slaughtered. And then I heard later on, also on the news, guy was a Nazi. He's targeting Mexicans. I didn't see anybody on the right saying we have to make murals for all the people who were murdered. I didn't see people on the right saying we all have to grieve. I didn't see people on the right saying we gotta get a bunch of money in and let's try to help people and get some murals of all the victims on the walls on every city of America. I didn't hear anybody talk about that. I just heard a bunch of talk about how the government's going to use it to take away our rights. And then we have this murder of Charlie Kirk. Tragic. Shouldn't be praising it. I'm not praising it. But now you have people on the Trump camp talking about suppressing speech. And I don't hear anyone on the right saying shit about it. They want to talk about mourning. They want to talk about grief. They want to talk about grieving. I didn't hear any of these people grieving when 23 people were massacred in El Paso. I didn't hear anybody grieving when kids were murdered in 2022 in Uvalde. I didn't hear anybody grieving about all the kids who were mowed down in Norway by Anders Breivik. I didn't hear shit. Nothing. And in fact, there was a shooting that happened in Norway this year. Some Nazi in Norway went into a school for immigrants where immigrants go to, adult immigrants go to school to learn the language and stuff like that, to try to integrate, because all these people talk about the importance of integration all the time. So these people are trying to integrate. And they were going to this school for adult immigrants, and some Nazi in Norway went into the school and shot a bunch of people up. And you can hear, because one of the immigrants hid in a bathroom and she was recording what was happening. She was doing a recording while in the room. You could hear the gunshots and you can overhear the Norwegian Nazi saying, "You don't belong here," before pulling the trigger. Boom, 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 boom. And you know what's amazing is I remember when the shooting happened, and all these Zionists on X/Twitter were saying, "Oh, it's a Muslim. Oh, it's a Muslim. Oh, it's a..." They're dying to use any sort of catastrophe for their own agenda. Then it turns out, no, it's actually a white guy who's a Nazi. Everyone shut all these Zionists, all these Ziocons, all the neocons, all the evangelicals, all the right-wingers. No, let's not talk about, shut our mouths. We're not talking about this. Because they don't want to talk about the news when it's a right-winger doing the killing. They just want to talk about a murder if it's a liberal or if it's a Muslim. If it's a liberal and if it's a Muslim, they talk about it they'll talk about it until the heavens hear. They won't stop. Because why? Because it's not about justice. It's not about actually condemning murder and violence. It's about advancing their own agenda. That's what it is. Bottom line. This whole thing about this girl who was murdered in a subway, right? This is one of the biggest stories ever. This has been one of the biggest stories since last month. What's her name? Irina Zarutska. She was murdered by a black guy he's still alive, an evil, demon-possessed individual. He sliced her. It was horrific. I saw the video. I was meaning to do a video about it, but I didn't. But it's horrific. I saw the video. He slices her throat and she's crying and she gets into the fetal position. It's horrific. What should happen? The guy who did the murder should be killed. Bottom line. He should be executed. Take that guy, take him to a firing squad, and kill him. Boom, that's it. Fuck all these bullshit about, the kind of lawyer here, human rights, and fuck that. He needs to die. He should be given the capital punishment. I'm all for the death penalty. I am 100% pro-death penalty, by the way. Maybe some of you guys are liberal. I know there's newer people who are listening to the stream now. I'm just here to tell you guys right now, I am not some bleeding heart Norman Finkelstein liberal. I know I've talked about Israel and Gaza because what's happening in Gaza is a crime, but believe me, I believe in the death penalty. And they are people who deserve the death penalty. And if you're critical of Israel and you disagree with me, well, maybe we can find some common ground. Would you agree that the IDF soldiers who snipe kids should be given the death penalty? I think they should be given the death penalty. Death penalty! Yes! Nuremberg trials, and then death penalty. Death penalty. But here's the thing. The left and the right are both responsible for this very divided and polarized society that we live in. They're both responsible. Oh, that sounds like a both sides argument. Yeah, it does, but it's true. They're both responsible. The left has a huge contribution to this because it's the left, and it has been the left, who has pushed for light on crime policy. Light on crime policy, which led to the murderer of Irina Zarutska being released from prison over a dozen times. The guy gets released from prison over a dozen times. Why is he being re-released over a dozen times? That guy should not have been on the street. So the so-called judge, who looks like a mental case, to be honest with you, doesn't look like a judge. When I think of a judge, I'm thinking of like someone who looks proper. This person doesn't look proper. It looks like a mental case. She needs to be put into a loon bin. But the so-called judge who released this guy should also face consequences. She should be arrested, tried for enabling crime. She should face responsibility for her actions. And so what happens? The left says, well, we have to be light on crime because, being hard on crime, being hard on even the worst criminals is fascism or murder or whatever, and it's terrible. It's tyranny. Oh, it's tyranny, guys. It's tyranny. It's horrible. So what happens? They're light on criminals. Criminals get enabled to do what? To do what criminals do best, crime. Then they do more crime. And then what happens? They do more crime, and then you have an Irina Zarutska story. Then the liberals say, oh my God, look, the righties are now using this story to advance racism. Yes, they are. But you know what? If that guy had never been allowed to be on the street in the first place, we wouldn't be here. And if there was a true tough on crime policy and crime was low in this country, racists wouldn't have a leg to stand on. But they have a leg to stand on right now, a very, very large and fortified leg to stand on because of the enabling of crime. Because they say, look at what these blacks are doing. Oh, they murdered Irina Zarutska. They rob all these stores. They do all the shoplifting. They do all this. They're overrepresented in certain crimes, shoplifting, murder, etc., gang violence, etc. And then those righty, and this is where the right plays a contributing factor in this, they fan the fuels. They fan the flames. And they use it for their own agenda. But what enables that? It's the light on crime policies. So if we were tough on crime, in other words, if we actually imposed justice, which is what the Bible tells us to do, then we wouldn't be in this situation. Because the criminals would be off the street. Plain and simple. But what happens when we go light on crime? Racism becomes popular. And do you know what else becomes popular? Fascism. Because what happens is the crime problem and the degeneracy problem, for example, the trans thing, becomes so bad that people no longer give a shit about democracy. People no longer give a shit about the Constitution. All that stuff is meaningless when you live in a shitty society. People don't want to see democracy. People want to see justice. Because people want to live a comfortable and peaceful life. And who can blame them? Every human being deserves a comfortable and peaceful life. To a certain extent, right? Everybody deserves peace. Not everybody. I know. Well, what about criminals? I'm talking about just generally speaking. This is all just general, all right? Everything I say is general. If you want to be a schizophrenic about it, then piss off to another show. But people deserve a peaceful and comfortable life. They don't deserve to go to the store thinking, am I going to get shot? Am I going to get robbed? What's going to happen? They don't deserve that. People don't deserve that. People don't deserve opening up a business and then fearing that an army of shoplifters are going to do organized hits on their stores and rob their products and then destroy their business. People don't deserve that, right? If someone opens up a business, they deserve to have that business be secure and safe. And they deserve to make money through their business. They don't deserve having to fear criminals coming and then stealing all their stuff. But we allow this. We enable it. Why? Because we say, well, it's just stealing. We're not really killing anybody. It's just stealing. And if it's less than $900 worth of products, then, it shouldn't be a felony. It should be a misdemeanor crime. And so all the criminals, all the shoplifters say, I got my itchy fingers. I'm just going to steal less than $900 worth of products. I'll be fine. It's just going to be a misdemeanor. Not a big deal. You see what happens? And then what happens? Stores get closed down. Businesses get closed down. People don't want to invest in certain neighborhoods. And then the people who live in those neighborhoods start complaining, oh my God, we live in a food desert. Where's the grocery stores? How come these nice areas have grocery stores? Because those nice areas don't have all the criminality. It's a bad investment to build a store or a shop in your neighborhood because your neighborhood sucks. Because it's full of criminals. So what happens? You have an erosion of societal trust. People don't trust each other as much. When people don't trust each other as much, then what happens is that you have a lack of harmony in society. Lack of harmony. People are not investing in entire swaths of territory. Then you have economic issues. Entire businesses get shut down. Murder rate goes up. Police officers don't want to go into certain areas because those areas are way too dangerous. So then you have even more lawlessness. And eventually what happens is people don't give a shit about democracy. They don't care about the Constitution. They care about having a clean and safe society. And in that type of a situation, what you have is a vacuum. You have a political vacuum. You could have a decent leader who, while disregarding some constitutional rules, will impose harsh laws on criminals and make the society better, and you don't necessarily have to have a Hitler or a Mussolini. But other times, you could have a Hitler or a Mussolini who pops up and says, you guys need a strong leader. Vote for me. And you vote for him, and he disregards the Constitution. He disregards all of the balance of powers, and he actually starts doing what Hitler did. or what Mussolini did, or what any one of these mass murderous leaders in the past did. And then you have an even worse problem. So, bottom line is, it goes back to what God says in the Bible. Justice is my metric. Justice is my measurement. Justice. What does Jesus say about the spirit of the law? Justice and mercy. Justice and mercy is really the foundation of all of God's law. Justice and mercy. And being merciful to the cruel is cruel to the merciful. Being merciful to the cruel is cruelty to the victims of the cruel. True mercy is to go against those who have no mercy. And true justice is to go against those who are absent of mercy, and those are the criminals. And so once you make a better society, then there is no reason for people to say, we should be racist. They're not going to have any sort of propaganda fodder by which to spread racist ideology. And when you have a secure and clean society, you don't really have to worry about dictatorships. You don't really have to worry about fascism, because people aren't going to be looking for a hero to save them, because they're already going to be living in a secure and clean society. But what happens when you have political violence, or when you have excessive polarization or division in a society, you have room for mass manipulation. And in comes false flag attacks, in comes Gladio, in comes using terrorism to advance some sort of a policy, and then the government can say, well, it's this side that did it, and then they have a sort of pretext to silence people. And at first, they're going to silence the criminals. At first, they're going to silence the terrorists. And we're all going to say, okay, well, I'm not a terrorist, so I really don't care. And it's fine. If they want to just silence the terrorist, I have no issue with that. If they just want to get rid of the terrorist, I have no issue with that. The question is, are they going to stop at just terrorist? That's the question. That's what we have to look out for. Are they eventually going to come after people who are just critical of American foreign policy? Are they going to go after people who are critical of Israel? And perhaps fulfill what Christ warned us about when he said they will take you to the synagogues. Remember what Christ told the disciples. He said, they will take you to the synagogues to put you on trial. That is a prophecy, which means that the synagogue is going to be an institution of persecution against Christians. Radical, hardline Jews are already persecuting Christians, and they're going to persecute Christians even more. Remember the warning of Christ, they will take you to the synagogue.